Welcome, viewers, to Buelna News. Your host, Gabriel Buelna. Today we have an interview with Dr. Enrique Buelna, PhD in history, UC Irvine. Enrique finished a book in 2019, but since the pandemic, he hasn't been able to do that many book tours. Enrique Buelna does happen to be related to me, oldest brother. But, we're going to do reviews and we're going to have questions for him. So let's welcome our guest today, Dr. Enrique Buelna. Enrique, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Where are you calling in from today? Where are you Zoom calling in?
So I am in Santa Cruz. I teach at a community college here, Cabrillo College. I'm in the history department there.
So we're going to talk about your book, Chicano Communist and the Struggle for Social Justice. And the book can be bought anywhere, Amazon, and wherever there's a good capitalist, you can find Chicano Communists. So let's get into the questions. Enrique, why did you write the book?
Well, the title probably goes back to the very beginning, and I probably was unaware. When I met Ralph and Jesús Cruz in 1998, I was going to the house and performing a series of interviews with them. And in the process, an incredible story unfolds. But before that, Jeff Garcilaso, who was my advisor at UC Irvine, suggested, and he used these words, and I think it just stuck to me. He said, basically, I want you to go talk to Ralph Cuarón. I interviewed him, but, it's not a part of my research. And he's this radical Chicano who was in the Communist Party. And I think subconsciously it must have stuck, but I will tell you, the story that unfolds within sort of the Communist Party, Ralph Cuarón's, and the participation of other Mexican Americans within the party is a pretty incredible one. One of the things that struck me, I was surprised within the archives, was finding information, that discussed the controversies, sort of the struggle that Mexican Americans were having within the party. Mexican Americans,
the Communist Party, within the Communist Party. Okay.
Mexican Americans were not prioritized within the CP. African Americans were. The African Americans were identified as a nation, right? Sort of within a nation. I won't get into the complexities of that, but Mexican Americans were not. They were identified, and unfortunately, sometimes as a transient or temporary or foreign entity. And so very little attention was given to them. And Ralph Cuarón and Mexican Americans were fighting for their history, for their culture, for language, all of these things within the CP. And there's a lot of evidence towards that. Ralph Cuarón's family, his children, in fact, his eldest daughter, Mita Cuarón, was led the walkouts of 1968. So this is in the midst of the civil rights movement. And Ralph Cuarón, his organizing, his influence, his work with youth was prior to that, but it blended right in. It went right into this period. And many of those youths of that period visited that house, their house on Princeton Street in East Los Angeles. So Ralph Cuarón was immersed in this world and engaged in it and accepted and in fact and supported all of these students and all of their activism.
So you started to answer it, but what's the Mexican question? What's that? Not the whole chapter, but give us some specifics on the Mexican question.
Interestingly, in fact, one of the titles that I had thought of using was the Mexican question. And I was surprised. The Mexican question is not anything that I invented. In fact, the archives has that information. And basically, it's the Mexican Americans within the Communist Party trying to, again, make a space for themselves within the CP. They were making a case for themselves, right? That the Communist Party needed to do more to support Mexican Americans, right? To engage with them, to organize them. Now, let me just say that the book is not a criticism of the CP, but I hope to have a more balanced look at it. So there are the positive aspects of the Communist Party, but then there were those problems. And the chapter on the Mexican question really delves into the struggles that Mexican Americans would have in trying to, again, sort of create that space.
One of the things that I found interesting was that the children of Ralph and Sylvia Cuarón, who were members of the Communist Party, were involved in Chicano politics, in, like you said, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. Their children didn't know that their parents were members of the Communist Party. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, first, let me just clarify that their children were not members of the Communist Party. In fact, for most of their lives, they did not know that their parents were members of the Communist Party. And this goes back to to, this period of McCarthyism, the Red Scare, the fear. This is the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a period in which the Communist Party was attacked viciously. The FBI, for example, was followed the Cuarons and for many years, almost a decade, right? And so the families, like many American, radicals, members of the Communist Party, oftentimes kept this information a secret to protect their families and to protect themselves. And so their children did not know. However, their children were exposed to the activism that Ralph Cuarón and Sylvia Cuarón, his wife, were engaged in. They were active in their community. Go ahead.
What role did the FBI archives play in your research?
Well, I did a Freedom of Information request to the FBI, and I got 2 files on both of them, on Ralph Cuarón and Sylvia Cuarón. Those files were filled over a decade, filled with reports on the Cuarón. So they were following the Cuarons. They had a whole detailed description of their lives and their activism. Ralph Cuarón knew at some point that the FBI was after him, as the FBI several times confronted him, but he would not rat out, right, his fellow comrades. But he disregarded that and continued his activism.
So Enrique, in the 1950s, you had the House Un-American Affairs Committee. You had a whole struggle, the Cold War against the Communist Party. Some might argue that communists being involved in Mexican American politics hurt Mexican Americans. It maybe caused Mexican Americans to seem foreign. How would you respond to that?
I think that was a real serious concern. I think that, the period was very complicated. I think that Ralph many times confronted this issue and this problem. There were many Mexican Americans in other organizations like the CSO that were afraid and actively sought to discourage, to marginalize Mexican Americans who they knew were members of the Communist Party. They were absolutely afraid. Of course, the powers that be, right, utilized, any excuse to be able to destroy Mexican American political activism, and I think that was a very serious problem. And I think it's for that reason that sometimes many members of the Chicano members of the Communist Party kept their membership or their activism a secret, just so that folks would not be afraid. And I think that, definitely, any tinge of communism was a big problem for activists in the 1960s.
So did Ralph see the Communist Party as a place where he could be accepted? Did he like the ideas? Did he agree with the Soviet Union? Get into his mind a bit.
I don't think that Ralph Cuarón really cared that much about the Soviet Union. He cared about conditions in the United States, right, in his country. He saw the Communist Party as a vehicle, right, to attain civil rights, right, equal treatment. He saw in the Communist Party an organization that was willing to take risks, that they were the ones that were most courageously, right, moving and working with immigrant communities, with Mexican American communities, with Black communities, communities of color in general, and that excited him. And he saw in them a vision of bringing, forward greater democracy, greater equality, and he loved it, and he joined it happily.
So in 2020, if Ralph Cuarón was a young activist, would he have joined the Communist Party today, or would he have found enough outlets? What was the issue? Not enough outlets, or was it ideology?
No, or maybe it was a little bit of both. I mean, I think that, Ralph Cuarón joined it for all those reasons I just gave you. I think that, ideologically, I don't think that he was, stuck in any, whole, right? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that he was pragmatic. He was willing to work with people, even if they were outside of the party. Ralph Cuarón, for example, in East Los Angeles, worked with Edward Roybal. He and Edward Roybal, right, worked together in getting the message out about discrimination, police brutality, poverty, housing, and things like that. So Ralph was pragmatic. How would he be today? Would he be any different? I think he would still be an activist, a person who would take to the streets, right, who would challenge authority, If the Democratic Party was willing and able to do that, I think he would do it. Or any other sort of community-based organization, I think he'd jump into it.
So, do the struggles of Mexican Americans in the Communist Party? So, Mexican Americans within the Communist Party had issues of equality. What are some of the parallels of Mexican Americans constantly needing to fight for equality within some of these institutions, even the institutions that we have today?
Well, I mean, if I understand your question right, I mean, I think that, Mexican Americans in the, 1940s, 50s, and 60s were struggling to become visible. We're struggling with this marginalization by mainstream organizations. They were struggling with an attitude and arrogance that saw Mexican Americans as outsiders, interlopers, transient, and with no history. So Ralph Cuarón was struggling with these issues within the Communist Party, outside of the Communist Party. And I think that many Mexican Americans today have to struggle with these same ideas. I mean, you see it in the networks, you see it in movies. We're just not represented. Even in 2020, we don't exist. We're the largest ethnic minority group in the United States, and we largely are invisible.
So overall, what does your book help us to understand today? How did Ralph and Silvia Cuarón change the world?
Well, I think the way in which they are relevant today, in which the book is relevant today, has to do with, this notion of activism. In one part, in the preface to my book, I talk about this idea of a gadfly. Ralph Cuarón and Silvia Cuarón really identified her husband as a gadfly, right? So this buzzing, right, insect, well, not that he's an insect, but the idea is that you are constantly, right, agitating, right, taking to the streets, confronting authority, making people think, creating consciousness, right, making young people especially understand that they have power over their democracy. I think that in that sense, I think the book has a lot to teach us. Ralph Cuarón would have said there's only one way in which you can make change, and that's confronting authority, that's taking things to the street. And that's never going to change.
But let's be specific. Okay, so Ralph, you mentioned that he connected with Edward Roybaugh, grandfather of Mexican American politics. What else did Ralph do that specifically led to change that we could see today?
Well, Ralph was active in a number of organizations. He started many of them, even despite the fact that sometimes the CP was opposed to him. He helped organize the Civil Rights Congress, the Mexican American Civil Rights Congress. So the Civil Rights Congress was a civil rights organization, an aggressive civil rights organization during this period, and Ralph Cuarón sort of organized a branch of it. He helped organize, for example, the LA Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born, which helped to put emphasis on the plight of immigrants, right, and undocumented folks in this country. Ralph Cuarón helped to organize the Mexican American National Association, a major national civil rights organization at the time that's going to be destroyed by the FBI. So he was also, for example, Amigos de Wallace. He helped organize support for Henry Wallace's campaign in 1948. So Ralph was a consummate organizer. And
how did Ralph deal with conservatism within the Mexican community? Conservatism meaning with religion and being afraid of these ideas that many would have thought were not directly from the Mexican American Chicano community, such as communism. How did he deal with religion?
Well, that's pretty interesting. I think that I remember many interviews with them both, but mostly with Silvia, and this notion of tolerating Catholicism within their family. So in other words, the family knew that both Ralph and Silvia were not religious, but they would, for example, sneak in a baptism or two without the knowledge, and I'll put that in quotations, without the knowledge of the Cuaróns. But the Cuaróns did know that this type of stuff was happening. So in other words, my sense is that they were very tolerant. They were pragmatic, right? So they weren't willing to confront sort of that issue. But certainly we're not religious. They must have had some other sort of spirituality that was there. And they spoke to issues of equality. They spoke to issues of democracy. They spoke to issues of of morality, but in a larger, broader sort of working class equality notion that I think grabbed people, whether you were a believer in God or not. And so, I think that they could grab onto this idea of Chicano or Chicanismo and adopt it, but again, with this lens of pragmatism.
There seems to be a recurring theme that Mexican Americans and Latinos don't fit into the overall American story or narrative, that we're foreigners. What are your thoughts?
Well, see, that's a central issue or problem even within the book, that Mexican Americans at the time that I'm writing this book in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were arguing that they were very much a part of this history. And despite all of their efforts, they kept coming up across this barrier, this resistance to see them as a part of this country. And it was even a struggle even within a radical organization. I'm not saying everyone within the Communist Party. There were those who absolutely supported Mexican Americans and their struggle. But this sense, this arrogance, this feeling that we are newcomers is prevalent. And I see that even within my own teaching. Every single semester that I teach students, I find students are absolutely surprised that Mexican Americans would have experienced discrimination, lynchings, gerrymandering, extrajudicial killings, arrests, violence. They're very surprised, and we shouldn't be. This is American history, and yet it continues to be ignored.
So in looking at the narrative right now that's occurring in politics between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, as a historian and someone who studies politics, modern politics, tell us how Bernie Sanders maybe would have taken a Ralph approach, and how Biden in his approach to Mexican Americans and Latinos is playing itself out.
Well, I mean, I hope that Biden is going to really bring in Mexican Americans in a very significant way. However, when I look at what Bernie Sanders did and his campaign in reaching out, speaking to, listening to, engaging with, and bringing Mexican Americans into his campaign, it was fantastic. And you saw the results with Mexican Americans just surging in support of Bernie Sanders. I think this needs to be the approach. He showed respect, empathy, right? And folks were able to connect with Bernie Sanders. And I'm hoping that Biden will be able to do that. If he wants Mexican Americans to participate, to engage with, to come on over in an enthusiastic way, he's got to do that.
What do you think your book helps us to understand for today?
Well, maybe it helps us to understand that, we need to continue to challenge, right, these notions, these ideas, right, which are embedded in racism and discrimination, these ideas that Mexican Americans continue to be seen as outsiders when we're absolutely not.
But what specifically within U.S. society seems to be allowing a narrative that Mexican Americans specifically, Latinos in general, don't seem to be fit, accepted? You look at it in the vice presidential search, a Latina isn't even being polled. What's grabbing? What is occurring that Mexican Americans aren't in that narrative on a regular basis?
Well, I just simply think that we're not in the story. We're not viewed as being, a whole Americans. We're something else. And it's the fact that we're not embedded. We're not in the history that we are seen and continue to be seen as invisible. If that's the attitude that many Americans have about our communities, then it is no wonder then that we're not seen as viable or important voters, constituents, or people that can reach political power. The irony here is that Mexican Americans have reached and have gained important levels of responsibility within American society, yet there is something there, right? That's very strange, and I guess it only calls out the fact that Mexican Americans just have to, and Latinos in general, right, have to scream out louder.
Well, that goes to my point, is that Is it the fact that we're too nice? I mean, that we're not yelling and screaming enough? I mean, I look at a lot of Mexican American, Central American, Puerto Rican, Cuban American scholars, and I don't see that they're passionate about what they're saying, but there's a shyness about challenging the system. Why does it seem as though we are shy about making demands?
Well, I think there's something to that. And one of the lessons that I learned from doing this book is that Ralph challenged that. He wanted and demanded that Mexican Americans, right, in particular, Latinos in general, right, stand, move forward, move more aggressively to make demands of society, not to be silent, but to look power directly in the face and to not be afraid of it. Therefore, for example, in his development of consciousness with young people, with students, with workers, right, he educated them about their rights, right? We own the streets, we own the air, right? It is ours as a society. And what we need to do is we need to demand that it be given to us.
Enrique Buelna, your book, Chicano Communist. Viewers, read it. Enrique, final thoughts?
No, I just, encourage folks to take a look at the book. This is about Mexican American labor history. It is about, the history of identity. It's about activism, and it's an important part of our history.
If you have a book and enjoyed the book review that we just did on Chicano Communist, email me at buelnanews@gmail.com. Send us the title of your book and a way to contact you, and we'll get a hold of you and get going with the book review. We have a lot of great content coming up, so if you're on Facebook, share and like us. If you're on Twitter, follow and retweet. If you're on Instagram, follow us, and if you're on YouTube, subscribe, share our content. Be good to your families in this time, and have a good rest of your day.